The city of Boston recently came out with a new report on climate change. The report has an update on the risks and challenges for Boston and on ways to respond. To tell us about Climate Ready Boston is the Commissioner of the Boston Environment Department, Carl Spector. Thank you very much for being with us, Carl.
Thank you for inviting me.
One thing in this report that seemed to be fairly almost alarming but not altogether new is that the changes you foresee are essentially going to remake the map of the city.
Well, they have that potential depending on the steps that we take over the next few decades.
Well, one of the things, of course, the most dramatic thing is that the rise in sea levels, and there was one graphic in the report showing, especially in areas of East Boston, South Boston, the South End. Talk about that projection. Again, it may not turn out that way, but it certainly looks like it's something that you got to do something about here.
Well, no, absolutely. It is more than likely that towards the end of the century we will see at least 3 feet of sea level rise. And we do need to start thinking about what we're doing to prepare for that. Obviously, some parts of the city are more vulnerable than others. South Boston and the Seaport, East Boston, downtown, Charlestown, some parts of Dorchester. And we want to start the planning now to think about how to reduce those risks. And we want to stay flexible as we do that planning so that we can adjust as we see exactly how much and how fast the sea level is rising.
Well, certainly one thing that struck me from that map is that at some point, maybe you won't have to be overseeing it, but you've either got to replace or retrofit a whole lot of housing. Because you're talking about South End and East Boston.
Well, absolutely right. We want to think about it. So we want to make sure that new buildings that are built today and from now on are resilient and are thinking about the future. And we need to think about how we can make existing buildings, and most of the buildings that will be in Boston 30 or 40 years from now are already here. We need to think about how we can make those buildings more resilient and less vulnerable to sea level rise. That's true.
Now, there are a lot of people who say, well, this is a gradual process at worst, maybe. So what's the big worry? Because I guess the worry is that you're going to have these exceptional events where you're not just going to have this average increase in temperatures and sea levels.
Well, first of all, we can already see the effects of sea level and climate change in general. Now, we need to keep in mind in Boston, even though we think about sea level rise and coastal flooding as the most obvious effect of climate change, we want to keep in mind that there's inland flooding from increased intensity of precipitation, and there's heat during the summer. But to address the issues about sea level rise, the sea level has been rising. The pace of rise is accelerating, and we are seeing more flooding, especially at this point, fortunately, mostly nuisance flooding in Boston. That in the past couple of years, there's been a lot of attention paid to king tides, and we can see where the sea and the tides are occurring more regularly in places where we got them just occasionally, and that is just going to increase. So we haven't faced a really big storm in a few years, and that's fortunate for us, but we know that they are going to come, and we need to be prepared for that, both in areas which are currently vulnerable to flooding from a big storm, and the areas that will become vulnerable to flooding from a big storm, even within 10 or 20 years. That's not far away.
We're talking with Carl Spector from the city's Environment Department. Carl, talk about some of the things that are really up front right now in the short term that have to be dealt with. Morrissey Boulevard, those washouts that seem to be happening more frequently.
Well, as you may know, Chris, the state is looking to do a lot of work on Morrissey Boulevard, and we're participating in the planning around Morrissey Boulevard, and one of the things we're looking at is to make sure that considerations of sea level rise are brought into the planning of Morrissey Boulevard. The city, we recently received a grant from the Commonwealth, from the Office of Coastal Zone Management, to look at 2 specific flood pathways, one in East Boston and one in Charlestown, areas that are vulnerable now and become increasingly vulnerable. And we are going to start the design and the community engagement around those 2 areas, in part because, as I already said, they're vulnerable now, and also because we expect to learn a lot about how to do flood protection and climate planning on a larger scale from the work that we do at those two specific sites.
Because another concern here, quite different from the flooding, is the heat island effect that's foreseen. Talk about that.
Well, people here in Boston already know what heat is, and this summer we had 22 days of weather, 22 days that were over 90 degrees during the day, and 30 years ago the average was about 11. So we're already, again, starting to see what greater heat in Boston looks like. There are things that people can do in, again, their own houses to make sure they're energy efficient, that they have plans of what to do in case there are power failures. The city is making sure that its network of cooling centers and emergency centers are properly equipped, and we're putting extra measures for backup power in some of those community centers and emergency centers, so that in case people need to go to them, we're ready to receive them.
What about the way to at least mitigate, if not prevent, some of these, at least some of the bad effects? I mean, it does cutting down the carbon footprint on a massive scale. Does that really give you much bang for the buck?
It has enormous benefits. Last June, the first part of the Climate Ready Boston report was published, and this is new projections of what climate change effects are going to be in Boston. And we had a group of scientists from around the state convene and got together the most up-to-date information that was available then and come up with projections. They looked at three different scenarios. We called them the business as usual, the high emission scenario, a low scenario that was mostly equivalent to meeting the Paris Accords that were signed last winter, and then there was a medium scenario. And even though the climate projections didn't change much from one scenario to another over the next 20 years, by the end of the century there are substantial differences from the effects that Boston will see and the rest of the world will see, depending on how successful we as a global community are in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So it's very important, and the importance grows as we get farther out in time.
What also strikes me here about the political factor, and regardless which party it controls things in Washington, is that these effects hit harder in some parts of the country than others. Does that mean that maybe politics in the future means that those parts of the country have to work together instead of just waiting for Washington to figure out what to do?
Well, we certainly do need to work together, certainly, but I would stress that we are not at all reliant on what happens in Washington for a lot of what happens here in Boston. We've been working on climate in the city of Boston for a dozen years. We got started at a time when the federal administration was not particularly receptive to working on climate change, and though that's changed, and it may change again, but we got a lot going at that time here in Boston, working with our local partners and working with other cities across the country to take steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to become more energy efficient, and to start taking steps around climate adaptation. And we will continue doing that here in Boston. We're working closely with our neighbors here in the Metro Boston area, the other municipalities, and we have an excellent partner in the Commonwealth. We've been working very closely with the Baker administration on climate mitigation, on energy, and on climate adaptation issues, and we expect that to continue.
Thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Boston's Environmental Commissioner Carl Spector. In a moment, celebrating the spirit of peace in Dorchester, but first, this message.